The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl dragged behind a dusty shack, and his violent rescue shocked the outlaws hunting her. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold, gray morning, the kind where the air seems to hang heavy with an unspoken promise of trouble. Jake, Reaper, Morrison was riding along the back roads of nowhere, his Harley-Davidson roaring beneath him, the thick tires gripping the winding road with expert precision. The wind cut through the worn leather of his jacket, but he hardly noticed. He had lived this life for years, long stretches of nothing, endless miles of road, and the solitary hum of the engine. A brief respite from the chaos he once thrived in. His past life with the Hells Angels seemed like a distant memory now, but the weight of his reputation still followed him wherever he went. He was a man who had seen it all, and he didn't expect that to change anytime soon. As he neared a small, dilapidated shack that barely stood against the wind, he heard it. A scream, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Instinctively, his hand tightened around the throttle, pulling him toward the sound. It was coming from behind the shack, the same place the road seemed to end and where the earth had already begun to reclaim what was once human-made. Jake's heart began to race, not from fear, but from something deeper, a primal need to protect. He had made a promise long ago, a promise he had failed to keep, but maybe this was his chance to make things right. As he rounded the corner, he saw her. A small girl, no older than 10, was being dragged by two men, her legs scraping against the dirt. She kicked and screamed, but her voice was weak, her body too frail to fight them off. The men, larger than life and covered in grime, were too focused on their task to notice Jake's approach. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was personal. He couldn't stand by and let this happen. Not again. He killed the engine, silently dismounted, and in one fluid motion, he was upon them. The first man never saw it coming. Jake's fist collided with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The second man turned, but before he could react, Jake's boot was in his chest, sending him tumbling backward into the dirt. The girl, terrified, looked up at him with wide, panicked eyes, as if she couldn't quite comprehend who he was. Jake crouched down beside her, his massive frame casting a shadow over her small body. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The words sounded strange to him, but he meant them. She shook her head, tears streaming down her dirt-smeared face, too scared to trust him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a water bottle, offering it to her. "I'm here to help. No one's going to hurt you anymore." She hesitated, then took the bottle, her small hands trembling as she drank. Jake kept his gaze fixed on her, making sure she felt safe. For a moment, there was silence, only the sound of the wind and the distant howl of a dog. The girl finally looked up at him, her fear slowly fading. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die." Jake's heart clenched. He had been that girl once, vulnerable, alone, and terrified. The guilt from his past weighed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. He had a job to do now. As he helped her to her feet, the first of the men began to stir, groaning as he regained consciousness. The girl flinched, and Jake turned to face the two men, fury burning in his eyes. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Jake could hear the man groaning behind him as he helped the little girl to her feet. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, but he fought to stay calm. The girl, no more than 10 years old, was looking up at him now, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. Her small frame, fragile in comparison to his bulk, seemed even more fragile now that she was standing. The remnants of dirt and blood smeared across her face only made her seem more vulnerable. Jake's gaze hardened as he turned back to the two men who were now beginning to stir on the ground. The first one, the larger of the two, was starting to push himself up, holding his jaw where Jake had hit him. The second man groaned, but remained motionless, clearly knocked out cold. Jake's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get the girl to safety before things got worse, but the anger inside him couldn't let him walk away just yet. He clenched his fists, staring down at the two men. "Get up," Jake growled, his voice like gravel scraping across stone. "Get up, and you better start explaining what the hell you thought you were doing." The first man, gritting his teeth, slowly rose to his feet, rubbing his bruised jaw. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of fury and fear. He staggered, but managed to stay upright. "You don't know who you're messing with, do you?" The man spat, his voice thick with venom. "I don't care who you are," Jake replied, stepping closer, towering over the man. His voice was colder now, more dangerous. "You laid your hands on her. That's all I need to know." The man's eyes flicked to the girl, and Jake could see the calculation in his gaze. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out if he could overpower Jake or not. But Jake wasn't going to give him that chance. "You're not going anywhere," Jake said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He moved faster than the man could react, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the side of the shack. "Not until you tell me what you were doing with this kid." The girl flinched at the sound of Jake's voice, but she didn't move away. Her wide brown eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there now. Something like trust, though Jake knew it would take more than one moment to earn her full trust. He turned back to the man, keeping his grip tight. "What did she do to you? What did you want with her?" The man swallowed, his eyes darting to the unconscious body of his partner. We were just trying to teach her a lesson," he muttered. Jake felt a surge of disgust rise up inside him, but he kept his anger in check. "A lesson," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You think you're going to teach her anything? You think you're going to get away with this?" The man winced, but Jake's grip only tightened. "Tell me who sent you. Tell me why you were dragging her behind that shack like she was nothing." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the ground. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he spoke. "It wasn't just us. There's a gang, the Ravens. They've been looking for her." Jake's mind went cold at the mention of the Ravens. The Ravens were a rival gang, known for their brutality and violence. They had a reputation for doing whatever it took to intimidate and control, and from the sound of it, they had their sights set on this girl for a reason. Jake's jaw clenched, the fury burning in his chest. "The Ravens," he muttered. "What did they want with her?" The man shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. "I don't know, man. I swear. They just told us to bring her to them." Jake could feel the blood rush to his ears, the fury boiling over. He looked at the girl, standing there with a blank expression, still processing everything that had just happened. He had to act fast, or the Ravens would come looking for her, and he wasn't about to let that happen. "Get in the truck," Jake said, turning to the girl. She hesitated, looking from him to the two men who were now backing away, clearly defeated. But she didn't move toward the truck. Instead, she stood still, her gaze fixed on the man who had tried to drag her away. Jake's heart ached as he saw the pain in her eyes. He had seen that look before, and it hit him harder than he expected. He knelt down in front of her, meeting her gaze. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice gentler than he intended. "I promise you, we're going to get you out of here." She didn't speak, but the faint nod she gave him told him that, for the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt like she could trust him. Jake helped her into the truck, watching as the girl climbed in, her small body trembling with what he could only guess was a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He slammed the door shut and turned to the two men. "You better get out of here," Jake warned, his voice harsh. "You're lucky I don't leave you here for the Ravens to find." With that, he climbed into the truck and slammed the engine to life. The tires spun as he drove away, the two men still standing there, watching them go. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He knew the Ravens wouldn't let this go easily, and if they came after the girl, they would have to go through him first. Jake's eyes scanned the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he drove through the desolate roads, the truck's tires crunching over gravel. The girl sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. Jake could feel the weight of her silence pressing against him. She hadn't said much since they left the shack, and he didn't push her. He knew better than to force someone to speak before they were ready. The truck rumbled along the highway, but Jake's mind was far from the road. The Ravens were still out there, and this wasn't over. They were going to come for her, and when they did, they wouldn't hesitate to take what they wanted, no matter who got in their way. He knew the kind of people the Ravens were. He had dealt with them before, and he had no intention of letting them lay a hand on her. As they neared the small town, Jake slowed down, making a quick turn onto a narrow road that led to his place. It wasn't much, just a small cabin tucked away in the woods. But it was safe, and it was the best he could offer her right now. He pulled into the driveway and parked the truck. The girl didn't move, still staring ahead, lost in her thoughts. Jake took a deep breath and turned to her. "We're here," he said gently, hoping his voice would break through the tension that had settled between them. She looked at him for the first time since they left the shack. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there now. A flicker of trust, maybe even hope. She nodded slowly and climbed out of the truck, her small feet crunching against the gravel as she followed him up to the porch. Jake opened the door and stepped aside, letting her go in first. The cabin was modest but comfortable, with wooden beams that crisscrossed the ceiling and a crackling fire burning in the hearth. There wasn't much to it, but it felt like home. He gestured to the couch. "You can sit there," he said, his voice softer now, a far cry from the commanding tone he'd used earlier. She nodded again, hesitating before sitting down. Jake went into the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water, handing it to her. She took it without a word, her hands still trembling slightly as she unscrewed the cap. Jake watched her for a moment before sitting down in the armchair across from her. "I'm not going to ask you about what happened back there," he said, his voice quiet. "But I will say this, you're safe here. And as long as you're here, I'll make sure nobody touches you." The girl didn't respond, but Jake saw her shoulders relax a little, the tension easing just slightly. He knew she wasn't ready to open up yet, and that was fine. It was more than enough for him that she was still here, still alive. For the first time in what felt like a long while, Jake let himself breathe. He didn't have a plan for what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let the ravens get their hands on her. The night stretched on, the fire crackling in the background as Jake kept a watchful eye on the girl. He wasn't going to sleep. Not tonight. Not when there was a chance the ravens could be out there looking for her. After a while, the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on the fire. Jake's heart clenched at the question. He had heard it before, from other people, but this time it felt different. This time, the words carried a weight, a need for reassurance. He thought about how he would answer. The man he used to be wasn't someone he wanted to revisit. The man he had become, though, was still a mystery to him. He wasn't sure if he could even explain it. "I'm someone who won't let them hurt you," he said finally. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the truth. She nodded, as if accepting that answer, even though she didn't fully understand. The silence settled back between them, comfortable and heavy, but neither of them seemed ready to break it. Jake stared into the fire, the flames flickering in his eyes. He was already thinking about what came next. The ravens wouldn't stop looking for her, and if they found out she was here, they would come. And when they did, Jake knew he would have to fight. He had never been afraid of a fight, but this time it was different. This time, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, and that made all the difference. He glanced over at the girl, who was now resting on the couch, her eyes closed, her body curled into a ball for warmth. She was so small, so fragile, but there was a strength in her that reminded him of someone he used to know, someone he had failed. The guilt flared up in his chest again, but he pushed it down. There was no time for guilt. Not now. The ravens were coming, and he had to be ready. The night stretched on, but Jake didn't move. He stayed there, watching over her, his mind already racing through the possibilities of what was to come. He knew the ravens wouldn't stop, but neither would he. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the small cabin. Jake had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was to come. The girl, now resting on the couch, had managed to drift off to sleep for the first time since they left the shack. Her face, no longer streaked with dirt and blood, looked fragile in the soft light, her body curled up, trying to find warmth. Jake stood at the window, looking out at the woods surrounding the cabin. It was peaceful now, but he knew the calm wouldn't last. The ravens were coming. He could feel it in his gut. They wouldn't stop until they found her. And when they did, Jake wasn't sure what he would do. He had a past with the ravens, a past he wasn't proud of, but now, with this girl in his care, everything was different. He couldn't let them get to her. He wouldn't. The sound of the fire crackling in the hearth was the only noise in the cabin, the silence between them thick. Jake's gaze shifted to the girl again. He didn't know her name. She hadn't said a word about who she was or why they were after her, and Jake wasn't about to push her for answers. She had been through enough. He couldn't imagine the kind of fear she'd been living in. But what if he could help her? What if he could give her a chance at something better than what the Ravens had planned for her? He shook his head. There was no time for questions. He had to act. He turned away from the window and crossed the room, crouching down in front of the girl. She stirred, her eyes blinking open, still groggy from sleep. For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are they coming for me?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake's heart clenched. He hadn't wanted to say it, but she needed to know the truth. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not going to let them get you." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. She just stared at him, her face still unsure, but somehow trusting. Jake had seen that look before, but this time it hit him differently. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he wasn't sure if he even recognized the man he had become. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this girl become another victim. Not if he could help it. He stood up and reached for his jacket, pulling it on as he prepared to step outside. "Stay here," he said. "I'll make sure it's safe before you come out." She didn't argue. She just nodded, looking at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Jake stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The morning was still quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last. He needed to make sure the cabin was secure, check the perimeter, and make sure no one had tracked them here. As he moved around the cabin, his mind raced. He thought about his past, about the men he used to ride with, the life he had left behind. He had made plenty of enemies, but he never thought it would come to this, fighting for someone else's safety, fighting for someone who had nothing to do with his past, someone who needed him when he least expected it. He walked back around the front of the cabin, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Nothing. But his instincts told him that something was coming, and he couldn't afford to wait around to find out what. He went back inside, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. The girl was sitting up now, her eyes searching his face. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice small but filled with worry. Jake walked over to the table, his hand resting on the edge as he turned to face her. "We're going to leave," he said, "but I need to make sure it's safe first. The Ravens won't stop. They'll be looking for us." She nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She was scared, he could see that, but she was trying to be brave. "Where will we go?" she asked. Jake hesitated, his mind racing for an answer. He didn't have one. He didn't know where they could go, but he couldn't stay here. The Ravens would find them eventually, and they would tear this place apart. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out. Just trust me. We're getting out of here." The girl nodded, and for the first time since they had met, a small, hesitant smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jake to know he was doing the right thing. He grabbed his keys from the counter and made his way to the door. "Stay put," he said again. "I'll be right back." As he stepped outside, he scanned the horizon again, looking for any signs of danger. The wind had picked up, blowing through the trees with a low, mournful sound. He wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but it made him uneasy. He moved quickly, checking the shed out back and the fence line to make sure nothing was out of place. As he turned to head back to the front of the cabin, he heard the unmistakable sound of engines revving in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. The Ravens were here. Jake's heart raced. As the unmistakable hum of engines filled the air, he stopped dead in his tracks, his body stiffening. There was no mistaking it. The Ravens were closing in. He turned quickly and sprinted back to the cabin, his mind running through his options. Every second counted. As he reached the door, he yanked it open, finding the girl standing in the same spot where he had left her, her eyes wide with worry. "They're coming," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. "Get your things. We have to go now." The girl's face fell, and Jake could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake's mind raced. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He didn't know where they could go, but he sure as hell wasn't staying here to wait for the Ravens to find them. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just get ready." She nodded, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the few belongings she had scattered around the cabin and stuffed them into a small bag. Jake moved to the window, pulling the blinds up just enough to get a glimpse of the road. The sound of the engines was getting closer. There were at least 2 bikes, maybe more. His stomach churned. He could feel them getting closer, like a storm on the horizon. Jake turned back to the girl. "Stay low," he said. "Don't make any noise. If they come up here, we're done. Understand?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. Jake's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an escape. The back door would be the best bet. It led to the woods, and from there, they could get lost in the trees. It was their best shot. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and rushed toward the back door. The girl followed him, staying close as they moved quickly but quietly through the small cabin. As soon as they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Jake pulled the door shut behind them, making sure it was securely closed. They couldn't afford any noise. The sound of the engines was deafening now, just around the bend. Jake led her toward the woods, his heart pounding. He didn't know how long they had before the ravens would come searching, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. They reached the edge of the trees, and Jake motioned for her to stop. He crouched down, staying low behind a cluster of thick trees, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The bikes were getting closer, the rumble of their engines vibrating through the ground. Jake's fingers clenched into fists, his teeth gritted. He wasn't going to let them get to her. He couldn't. His eyes flicked over to the girl, her face pale with fear. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just standing there, trembling, waiting for him to make a move. For a moment, Jake almost wished he could just leave, take her somewhere far away where none of this would matter. But he knew better. The ravens were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And he couldn't let that happen. The engines roared louder, and Jake could see the shadow of the bikes coming into view. He crouched lower, motioning for the girl to stay still. She pressed herself against the tree, doing her best to hide behind it. Jake held his breath as the bikes passed by, the rider's eyes scanning the area. They were so close, he could almost feel their presence, like a threat hanging in the air. But they didn't see him. They didn't see her. The bikes sped past, and Jake let out a quiet breath. They had made it through the first wave, but he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He looked back at the girl, her eyes wide with fear, but also with something else, relief. She was still alive. And so was he. For now, that was enough. Jake stood up, slowly, motioning for her to follow him. "We need to keep moving," he said softly. "They'll be back." She nodded, and together, they slipped deeper into the woods, the sound of the engines fading behind them. Jake's mind was already working, calculating their next move. They couldn't go far. Not yet. But he had to get them out of here, away from the ravens, away from the past that was chasing him. As they moved further into the trees, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. He had never been one to run, but now, with this girl's life in his hands, running seemed like the only option. He wasn't sure what would come next. He wasn't sure how he was going to keep her safe, but he was going to try. For her. And for himself. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dense forest. Jake moved silently through the trees, the weight of the girl's safety heavy on his mind. The ravens' bikes were still somewhere out there, probably regrouping. They hadn't gotten close enough to spot them yet, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they did. He could feel it in the air, that restless tension that always came before the storm. He glanced back at the girl, who was walking a few paces behind him, her small figure barely visible in the dense underbrush. She was still scared, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't making a sound. She was trying to be brave, and that made Jake's heart ache. He had seen too much of that kind of strength in people who had been forced to grow up too fast, and it never ended well. He had done it himself once, had to grow up before he was ready, had to fight for survival every single day. And now, here he was, protecting someone else. Protecting a little girl who didn't deserve this. He stopped walking and crouched down to the ground, checking for tracks. Nothing unusual yet. No sign of anyone following them. But that didn't mean they were safe. The ravens were patient. They knew how to track people, how to make them feel hunted without them even knowing it. "We're not safe here," Jake muttered to himself, standing up. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide, waiting for him to explain. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low. "But we're not going back to the cabin." She nodded, her face blank, and followed him as he turned and began walking again, deeper into the woods. Jake's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. He didn't have many options. The nearest town was a few miles away, but it was small, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't be spotted there. They needed to keep moving, Keep off the grid. They needed a place where they could disappear. The idea hit him like a shot. I know somewhere, he said, mostly to himself. The girl didn't ask where. She didn't need to. She trusted him. For reasons he didn't fully understand, Jake was determined not to let her down. They walked for what felt like hours, the dense forest growing quieter as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Jake kept checking over his shoulder, his instincts on high alert. He could feel them closing in. He didn't know when or how, but the ravens were out there, and sooner or later, they'd find them. By the time they reached the small cabin, Jake was exhausted. His legs ached from the trek, and his mind was spinning with 100 different scenarios of how this could all go wrong. He pushed open the door to the cabin with a quiet creak, and the girl followed him inside. The place was nothing special, just an old, run-down shack in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the hills. But it was off the radar, hidden from anyone who might come looking. Jake locked the door behind them and went to the small wood stove in the corner. He started a fire, the crackling of the flames filling the silence. The girl sat down at the table, still quiet, still distant. Jake didn't push her. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he could guess. She was scared. She was lost. And now she was stuck with him. He grabbed a couple of cans from the small cupboard and opened them, setting them on the table. You hungry? He asked. She nodded, not looking at him. I'm sorry you're in this mess, Jake said, sitting across from her. She didn't reply. He didn't expect her to. He reached over and slid the can toward her. We'll figure this out, he said softly. I don't know how yet, but we will. She looked up at him then, her eyes full of something. A mixture of fear and gratitude, maybe, or just exhaustion. Thank you, she whispered. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had saved her, but that didn't feel like enough. He had to protect her. The ravens weren't going to stop, and they had no idea what they were dealing with. He could handle them. He had to. He had to make sure she didn't have to live in fear any longer. Jake stood up, walking over to the window and peering outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was no sign of anyone yet. He turned back to the girl. Stay here, he said. Don't open the door unless it's me. She nodded, her eyes following him as he stepped outside. The world outside was quiet, too quiet. The forest around the cabin seemed to stretch on forever, the trees standing like silent sentinels. Jake moved cautiously, scanning the area, checking every angle. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, his heart pounding in his chest. The ravens were coming. He could almost hear them. But for now, they were safe. For now, Jake took a deep breath, pushing away the tension in his shoulders. He had to stay calm. For her. Jake's nerves were stretched thin, the feeling of being hunted clawing at him. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin as he moved silently around the perimeter. The fire inside the cabin had dwindled to just embers, and the silence was oppressive. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the ravens were close, too close for comfort. They wouldn't stop until they found her. His mind raced, calculating their options. There was no time to waste. The girl was still in the cabin, waiting for him, but Jake couldn't ignore the fact that danger was closing in. The ravens were experts in tracking, and if they picked up on their trail, there wouldn't be anywhere to hide. Jake's eyes scanned the woods around him. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot made his pulse race. But there was nothing, no sign of movement. Yet, his instincts told him they were getting closer. He turned back to the cabin, making sure the windows were locked tight. He could feel the weight of the girl's safety pressing on him, her fragile trust hanging in the balance. Inside, the girl was sitting on the couch, still silent, her eyes focused on the small fire that had burned out. Jake wasn't sure how much longer she could stay calm. He couldn't tell her everything. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But she had to understand. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here for much longer. He stepped inside and closed the door. Softly behind him, the girl looked up, her eyes tired, but there was still that flicker of trust. We need to go, Jake said quietly. The ravens are out there. They're not going to stop until they find us. Her face didn't change, but she nodded slowly. She was starting to understand. Jake grabbed his jacket and his gear, then turned to the girl. Listen to me, he said, crouching down in front of her. I'm going to get you out of here. You need to stay with me. Do exactly what I say, and we'll make it out. The girl's eyes locked on his, her expression steady. Okay, she whispered, her voice small but determined. Jake's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow. She didn't deserve this. She deserved a chance at a normal life. But the Ravens had other plans, and Jake wasn't going to let them take that from her. "All right," Jake said, standing up. "We're moving out. Keep close." The girl grabbed her small bag, and they stepped out into the night. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and the earthy smell of the forest floor. Jake led her along the path that wound through the trees, his senses alert, every step calculated. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting patches of silver light across their path. Every shadow felt like a potential threat. They walked for what seemed like hours, Jake keeping a steady pace, making sure the girl stayed close. His eyes constantly scanned the trees around them, looking for any sign of movement. The Ravens were out there, hunting them, but Jake wasn't going to let them catch up. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The trail eventually narrowed, and they came to a clearing. Jake stopped and looked around, making sure they weren't being followed. The silence was broken only by the distant call of an owl. "We're almost there," Jake said, turning to the girl. She nodded but didn't speak. She was still processing everything, still trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening. Jake led her through the clearing, into another thicket of trees. He could feel the tension building in his chest, every nerve on edge. And then, in the distance, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines. His heart dropped. They were here. The Ravens. He motioned for the girl to crouch down, and they both slipped behind a cluster of trees. Jake's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. The Ravens would spot them if they stayed too long. He peeked through the trees, watching the motorcycles approach. There were two of them, riding side by side, their engines roaring as they cut through the quiet of the woods. They were coming right toward the clearing. Jake clenched his jaw. This was it. He had to act. He turned to the girl, his voice low but urgent. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't make a sound. I'll take care of this." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. Jake moved quickly, slipping out from behind the trees, his body low to the ground. He crept toward the edge of the clearing, staying hidden in the shadows. The motorcycles grew louder as they got closer. Jake's pulse raced in his ears, but he stayed focused. The first biker sped through the clearing, not noticing Jake crouched in the shadows. The second biker followed closely behind. That was Jake's chance. As the second biker came within range, Jake leaped from his hiding spot, tackling the rider to the ground with force. The impact knocked the wind out of the man, and Jake quickly pulled his knife from his belt, pressing it against the biker's throat. "Move and I'll end you," Jake growled, his voice low but deadly. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear. Jake looked up at the other biker, who was now turning his bike around, realizing something was wrong. But it was too late. Jake was already on his feet, his focus sharp as a knife. He lunged at the other rider, knocking him off his bike with one swift move. The second biker landed hard on the ground, and before he could get up, Jake had his boot on his chest, pinning him down. The first biker was still lying there, breathing heavily, but Jake knew they wouldn't be out for long. He needed to finish this before they had a chance to call for backup. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice calm but cold. "I'm not here to kill you. I just want you to tell your boys to back off. If you go back and tell them you found nothing, maybe you'll live to see another day." The man, gasping for breath, nodded quickly. "I'll tell them," he stammered. "Just don't hurt me." Jake didn't say another word. He turned and motioned for the girl to follow him. They had to keep moving. The Ravens wouldn't stop looking for them, but Jake wasn't going to let them win. Not today. The sound of the motorcycles faded as Jake and the girl continued deeper into the woods, moving swiftly through the trees. Every muscle in Jake's body was tense, his senses sharpened. The adrenaline from the confrontation still coursed through his veins, and the weight of their situation was pressing on him more than ever. The Ravens had been close, too close. He couldn't afford another mistake. As they moved, Jake kept his eyes constantly scanning the forest. The girl walked a few paces behind him, her footsteps light but deliberate. She wasn't talking much, but Jake could see the strain in her face. She was trying to stay strong, trying not to show how scared she was. And he admired that, even though he knew it wasn't fair that she had to endure this. The sound of birds rustling in the trees and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot were the only noises that broke the silence. Jake wanted to believe they were safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. He turned to look at the girl, who was glancing nervously around, her eyes wide with caution. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation. She nodded but didn't say anything. He didn't push. Instead, he just kept moving, the weight of his boots muffled by the thick forest floor. They had to get to higher ground. There was a lookout point he knew of, not far from here. If they could get there, they could keep an eye on the road and have a better chance of spotting anyone following them. But with every step, Jake felt like the danger was getting closer, like the shadows in the trees were watching them. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, his fingers brushing the hilt. It was strange. He had always been a fighter, used to the violence and danger that came with the life he had led. But now, it felt different. Now, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her. And the thought weighed heavier than he had expected. As they reached a small clearing, Jake paused, holding up a hand for her to stop. He crouched low, scanning the area. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway. He didn't hear anything that suggested they were being followed, but his instincts were screaming at him to be cautious. The ravens wouldn't give up this easily. He knew them better than anyone. The girl came up beside him, her eyes wide with worry. Jake didn't want to scare her, but there was no time to sugarcoat things. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "But we're not out of the woods yet." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and they continued. The path through the forest grew steeper as they ascended the hill, the ground soft and muddy beneath their feet. Jake's legs were already aching from the constant motion, but he pushed forward, keeping his focus on the goal. It was quiet, too quiet. The further they went, the more Jake felt like they were walking into the unknown. The look on the girl's face told him she was starting to feel it too. She was scared, but she wasn't asking questions, wasn't hesitating. She was trusting him. And that was a weight Jake didn't take lightly. As they neared the top of the hill, Jake paused again, this time longer, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. They were almost there. The lookout point was just ahead, but something didn't feel right. The air felt thicker now, as though the forest was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere ahead, the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the silence. Jake's heart dropped. He motioned for the girl to stay still, his eyes darting around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The ravens weren't supposed to find them this quickly, not unless they had a tracker or something. But Jake didn't want to take any chances. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device, checking the battery. It was a GPS tracker, a precaution he'd started carrying after a few too many close calls. He checked the coordinates. The signal was faint but moving. They were definitely being tracked. "They're here," Jake muttered, more to himself. Then to the girl. The girl looked up at him, her face pale, her breathing quickening. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jake looked at her, trying to keep his expression calm. "Stay close," he said. "We're going to have to lose them. We're not safe yet." He turned quickly, heading back down the path they had come. The girl followed without question, her steps quick and quiet. They had to act fast. If the ravens were tracking them, they couldn't afford to be found. Jake's mind raced as he thought of their next move. There was a small cabin further down the road, an old place that hadn't been used in years. It was abandoned, and Jake had kept it as a fallback. If they could get there, they could hide, regroup, and figure out what to do next. They reached a small stream, the sound of the water flowing gently over the rocks masking any noise from their footsteps. Jake crouched by the water, motioning for the girl to do the same. He kept his eyes on the path, his mind alert to every sound. The motorcycles were still somewhere in the distance, the engines louder now, but they hadn't caught up yet. He wasn't sure how long they could keep this up, but he wasn't about to let them take her. He wouldn't fail her. Not again. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the distant sound of the motorcycles still ringing in his ears. The ravens were closing in, and he could feel the weight of their pursuit like a shadow following them through the woods. His instincts told him to keep moving, to keep the girl safe, but the pressure was mounting, and with every step, it felt like they were running out of time. They had reached the small cabin Jake had used as a fallback. It was hidden deep in the woods, an old shack with peeling paint and weathered wood. He had hoped they could lay low here, maybe find some peace, but the sound of engines grew louder. They were almost there. Jake stepped inside quickly, motioning for the girl to follow. The cabin was dark and cold, but it would have to do. He locked the door behind them, his eyes scanning the room for anything they could use. He had a few supplies stashed away, food, water, basic first aid, but that wasn't what he was worried about. The ravens weren't just after her anymore. They were after him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could outrun them. "Stay low," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're not safe here for long. We have to move again as soon as it's clear." The girl nodded, her face pale with fear, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. Jake could see it in her eyes. She was terrified, but she trusted him. That trust was heavier than any weight he had ever carried. He turned and moved toward the window, crouching down to peer through the small gap in the blinds. His eyes scanned the area, watching for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet, and that's what made him nervous. The sound of the motorcycles had stopped. He couldn't hear anything now. The silence was suffocating. He cursed under his breath. "Damn it," he muttered. He had hoped the ravens would pass by, but they were too close now. He had a feeling they had already surrounded the area, waiting for him to make a move. Jake turned back to the girl, his mind working fast. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "We can't stay here. We need to go, and we need to go now. If we're going to make it out of this, we need to stay ahead of them." The girl looked at him, her expression unreadable, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "I don't know yet, but we can't stay here. We'll keep moving, keep changing direction. We'll make it out of this, I swear." He moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the knob. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to face what was out there. But there was no choice. They had to move. He glanced back at the girl one last time, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than he intended. She was looking at him with that same trust, that same quiet strength. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he wasn't alone. They were in this together, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. "Stay close," he said, his voice softening just a little. "And keep quiet." The girl nodded, following him closely as he stepped outside. The chill of the night air hit him immediately, but it didn't bother him. He had been in worse conditions before. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about keeping her safe. They moved quickly, Jake leading the way through the trees, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. The silence around them was unnerving, but he didn't let it slow him down. They had to keep moving. He knew the ravens were close. He could feel them. The girl stayed close to him, her small figure barely visible in the shadows. Jake kept one hand on his knife, ready for anything. The path they were taking was winding, leading them further into the woods, away from any signs of civilization. The further they went, the more Jake felt the weight of their isolation. They were cut off from everything. No cell service, no backup, no help. Just them. And the ravens. After what felt like an eternity, Jake stopped in his tracks, his body tense. He held up a hand, signaling the girl to stop. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He listened for a moment, his heart racing. There it was. The unmistakable sound of an engine. Not far off. He turned to the girl, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay low," he said. She nodded quickly, understanding the danger. Jake moved toward a large tree, motioning for her to follow. They crouched behind it, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The sound of the motorcycle grew louder, and then, to Jake's horror, it stopped. Right in front of them. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he slowly turned to look at the girl. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she was still, silent. Jake reached for the knife at his side, his mind calculating his next move. He had to stay calm. He had to think. The motorcycle had stopped, but the ravens were smart. They wouldn't be fooled by a simple hiding spot. He had to think of a way out, a way to keep her safe. The engine cut off, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The engine went silent, and Jake's heart raced in his chest. The figure on the motorcycle, a tall man with a cold, calculating stare, dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. The girl beside him was barely a whisper in the shadows, but her presence seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Jake's mind was racing. He needed to make a move, but the slightest sound could betray them. He couldn't let that happen. His grip on the knife tightened. The man stood motionless for a moment, scanning the area with a practiced eye. His head tilted slightly. as if sensing something was off, but he said nothing. Jake dared not move. The stillness hung between them, each second stretching into eternity. He could feel the weight of the decision hanging over him, whether to stay hidden and hope the man would leave, or to act and take a risk. He glanced at the girl, her face pale and wide-eyed, but determined. She had been through too much, and Jake wasn't going to let this be the end for her. He could feel her trust, but that only made the stakes higher. The man took a step forward, toward the edge of the clearing. Jake held his breath, hoping that the moment would pass. But then, the man stopped, his eyes narrowing. Jake cursed under his breath. He had to act. Without warning, Jake surged forward, pushing the girl behind the thick trunk of a nearby tree, the bark scraping against his skin as he moved. He moved quickly, staying low, closing the distance between them with every step. The man turned, hearing the sudden movement, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. Jake dove for him, knocking him off balance, sending them both crashing to the ground. The man grunted in surprise, but Jake was already on top of him, the knife in his hand, pressing it to the man's throat before he could react. "You don't move," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear as he realized just how close he was to death. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Jake's heart was still racing, but his mind was focused. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to finish this quickly, decisively. The man's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared up at Jake. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his grip tightening on the knife. The man's lips curled into a smirk, even in the face of death. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, blood dribbling from the corner of his mouth. "We'll find you, no matter where you hide." "The Ravens." Jake pressed the blade harder into his throat, silencing him. "I don't give a damn about your gang," Jake hissed. "You're not leaving here alive if you don't tell me where the others are." The man's eyes flickered to the trees, a glance full of something Jake couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or defiance. "I don't know where they are," the man said, his voice strained. "But you'll never make it out of here. They'll hunt you down." Jake considered this for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. He wasn't going to let the Ravens win. Not after everything he had done to protect the girl. Not after everything she had already suffered. He stood up, pulling the man with him, dragging him to his feet with a rough motion. "Tell me something useful, or this will end right here, right now." The man swallowed hard, his face a mix of pain and pride. "They're coming for you. The Ravens don't give up. They never do." Jake shoved him away, frustration building in his chest. He had been hoping for something more concrete, a way out. But now, it seemed like they were out of time. "Then we'll make our own way out," Jake muttered to himself. He turned, looking back at the girl who was still hiding behind the tree, her eyes wide with fear, but full of silent gratitude. She had to be scared, but there was no time for fear. Jake's eyes hardened. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Not for her. Not for him. "We move," he said firmly. "We go now." The girl nodded, and together they slipped back into the shadows of the forest. Jake's mind raced as they moved quickly through the trees. His instincts were on overdrive, constantly searching for any sign of movement. The Ravens weren't far behind. He could feel it. The forest was alive with the sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor, the rustling of leaves, and the faint hum of engines in the distance. Jake pushed on, leading the girl further into the woods, knowing that the Ravens would follow. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, but he couldn't afford to stop. He wouldn't stop. Not now. He had come too far. Jake's pulse quickened as he led the girl through the dense trees. The air felt thick, like a storm was brewing, and every step in the forest seemed to echo louder than the last. He could still hear the motorcycles in the distance, their engines a constant reminder of how close the Ravens were getting. His eyes flicked back to the girl, her small frame struggling to keep up with his long strides. She was trying to stay strong, but Jake could see the exhaustion on her face, the weight of everything they had been through settling in her bones. She was just a kid, but here she was, running for her life with a man who had long since forgotten how to trust anyone. He had to keep it together. For her. He couldn't let her down now. They moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the forest closing in around them like a darkened maze. The sound of the motorcycles was still there, closer now, cutting through the quiet with a menacing hum. Jake kept his focus ahead, his senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. They had to keep moving. The ravens weren't going to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. He could feel the girl's presence behind him, her footsteps quiet but steady. She was still with him. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep ahead of the ravens, but he had to find a way to lose them, to get them to safety. Jake took a sharp turn to the left, leading them down a narrow, barely visible path. The trees were so close together now that the branches scratched against his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was fixed on one thing: escape. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded, but said nothing. She didn't need to. He knew she understood. The path grew steeper as they descended, the forest floor becoming more uneven, harder to navigate. Jake kept his pace steady, but he could feel the weight of his exhaustion starting to catch up with him. His muscles ached, his body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. He couldn't stop. Not when the ravens were still out there. Not when her life was on the line. They reached the bottom of the hill and entered a small clearing. The trees parted just enough to let the moonlight spill in, casting long shadows across the ground. Jake stopped for a moment, his breathing ragged. He turned to look at the girl, her face pale in the pale light, but her eyes still fixed on him. "We have to move fast," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They're getting closer. We don't have much time." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both knew what had to be done. Jake started to move again, his body aching, but his resolve stronger than ever. They had to keep going. They couldn't stop. He heard the faint sound of engines in the distance, the unmistakable roar of the ravens' bikes, and his heart skipped a beat. They were coming. They were close. He glanced over at the girl, who was now walking faster, her small legs trying to keep up with his. She was scared, he could see that, but there was something else there. Something that reminded him of the strength he had lost, but now saw in her. She was fighting, and it made him fight harder. They reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees began to thicken again. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The ravens wouldn't just let them run. They'd track them down, they'd corner them, and if they caught them... Jake gritted his teeth. No, that wasn't going to happen. Not while he was still breathing. Not while he still had a chance. He spotted an old hunting shack in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was a long shot, but it might give them a temporary hiding spot. "Come on," he said, his voice urgent. "We're heading for that shack." The girl didn't question him, just followed his lead as they made their way through the trees. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, and Jake could feel the pressure mounting. He pushed himself harder, his legs moving faster, his breathing coming in short, ragged bursts. The shack was closer now, but there was still no sign of the ravens. They had to stay ahead. They had to get there before they were spotted. The girl's footsteps faltered, and Jake turned to look at her, concern flashing across his face. She was stumbling, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Keep going," he urged, but his voice softened. "We're almost there. Just a little further." She nodded, her face pale but determined, and pushed herself forward. Jake's heart ached seeing her like this. She was just a kid. She shouldn't have to run for her life. They shouldn't be hiding in the woods, praying to make it through the night. But this was the world they lived in now. A world where survival meant trusting no one but yourself. They reached the shack, and Jake moved quickly to the door, checking the area around them before he opened it. The shack was old, its wood weathered and rotting, but it would have to do. He pulled the door open, motioning for the girl to go inside first. She stepped in, and Jake followed, closing the door behind them. The small room was dim, with only a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. For now, it was enough. "We need to rest," Jake said, his voice low. "But we can't stay here long. As soon as we catch our breath, we're moving again." The girl nodded again, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She sat down on the floor, her small shoulders slumped, but she didn't complain. She just sat there, waiting. Jake leaned against the wall, his mind still racing, the sound of the motorcycles still echoing in his ears. They were safe for the moment, but he knew it wouldn't last. Not if the ravens found them. Not if they didn't move fast enough. Jake stayed close to the girl, his eyes constantly darting to the cracks in the shack's walls, listening for any sound that might betray their position. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the rotting wood of the shack, making it feel like they were even more exposed. He could feel the pressure mounting. The ravens weren't far behind. The girl, sitting quietly against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest, didn't seem to notice the silence, but Jake did. Every minute felt like an eternity, the air thick with the weight of their situation. He knew they couldn't afford to stay here much longer. It was only a matter of time before the ravens figured out where they were. They would come for them, just like they always did, relentless and without mercy. Jake couldn't allow that. Not this time. Not with her. We have to go, Jake said, breaking the silence, his voice low but firm. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with fear, but also a quiet determination. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. She knew what was at stake. Jake moved to the door, carefully peeking out through the crack. The moonlight shone faintly through the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with every gust of wind. The coast was clear, for now. He turned back to the girl. Let's go. We need to keep moving. She nodded, standing up slowly, still wary but following his lead. They had no choice but to keep going. Jake grabbed his jacket, his fingers brushing the knife at his side as he readied himself. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The girl followed him out the door, her small feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. The woods were dense, the trees towering over them, the darkness closing in around them like a suffocating blanket. Jake kept his pace steady, but every step felt like they were running out of time. He kept checking behind them, his senses on high alert. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The ravens were out there. He could feel it. He could feel them closing in. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sound of the motorcycles started to echo through the trees again. The engines, once distant, were growing louder. Jake's heart skipped a beat, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. The ravens were here. He pushed forward, urging the girl to keep up. The path ahead was uneven, the forest floor littered with fallen branches and rocks. He could hear her struggling behind him, but she kept going. She was tougher than Jake had expected, and that gave him a strange sense of relief. If she could keep moving, so could he. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop. Every time Jake turned to look back, the sound of the motorcycles grew louder. The ravens were getting closer. They were being hunted. Jake's mind raced for a solution. He had to lose them. But the forest was thick, and the roads were few and far between. There was nowhere to hide. They couldn't outrun them. He glanced to his right and saw a small, abandoned shack up ahead, just beyond the trees. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. It was the only chance they had. Jake's pace quickened. He wasn't sure if the ravens were following them directly, but he knew they were closing in. He could hear the thumping of their engines, growing nearer. The shack might provide some cover. At least it was better than nothing. He reached the shack in seconds, glancing back once more to make sure the girl was still with him. She was right behind him, her face pale but determined. She was scared, but she wasn't stopping. Jake quickly pushed open the door to the shack and pulled the girl inside, closing the door softly behind them. The shack was cold, its walls creaking in the wind. Jake moved to the small window at the back, peering out through the crack. The motorcycles were close now. He could hear them almost right outside. He held his breath, listening, waiting. The sound of the engine stopped. The ravens had arrived. Jake's heart raced, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. He glanced back at the girl, who was huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't crying, but Jake could see the weight of everything pressing down on her. He wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, that they would make it through this. But he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure if they could make it out this time. The silence outside stretched on, and Jake's grip tightened on the knife at his side. He couldn't let them find them. He couldn't let them take her. He had to protect her. The door creaked open, and Jake's pulse spiked. He quickly stepped back, staying low to the ground. His eyes never left the door. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted in the moonlight. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the man by the throat and slamming him against the wall. The knife flashed in the dim light, but before Jake could strike, the figure raised his hands in surrender. Wait. The man gasped, struggling to breathe. I'm not one of them. Jake froze, the knife still at the man's throat. He could feel the tension in his body, his heart hammering in his chest. Who are you? Jake demanded, his voice cold and dangerous. The man's eyes widened. I'm not with the ravens, he said quickly. I'm trying to get away from them too. They've been hunting me. Jake kept the knife steady, not trusting the man for a second. He wasn't sure if this was some kind of trick, but the desperation in the man's voice felt genuine. He lowered the knife slightly, but didn't let his guard down. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice rough. The man looked over at the girl, who was still huddled in the corner, her eyes full of suspicion. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, raising his hands. "I just want to get out of this mess. I can help you, but we need to move fast." Jake looked back at the girl, his mind racing. He didn't know if he could trust this man, but they didn't have time to argue. The ravens were out there, and they were getting closer. He made a decision. "Fine," Jake said, "but you try anything, and I'll finish this." The man nodded, his eyes showing no sign of deception. Jake lowered the knife completely, motioning for the girl to come closer. They had to move, and fast. Time was running out. Jake kept his eyes on the stranger, his grip still firm on his knife. His heart was racing, but he knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. The ravens were still out there, hunting them, and now there was an unknown man in the mix. Trust didn't come easy for Jake, especially when it came to someone with a past connected to the ravens. But right now, they didn't have much of a choice. He looked at the girl, still standing in the corner, her small frame huddled up in the shadows. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she wasn't crying. She had been through enough. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of protective instinct. Whatever happened next, he had to make sure she was safe. The man, still holding his hands up, took a careful step forward. "I'm not with them," he repeated, his voice softer now. "I'm just trying to get away from the ravens. They've been chasing me for weeks." Jake didn't lower his knife, but his posture relaxed slightly. The man seemed genuine. Still, Jake wasn't willing to risk their lives on a hunch. "And why should we trust you?" Jake asked, his voice low. The man glanced over at the girl, his eyes filled with an emotion Jake couldn't read. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted," the man said, his voice rough. "And because I can help you, if you'll let me." Jake studied the man, trying to gauge his sincerity. His instincts were on high alert, but there was something in the man's eyes, something that made Jake pause. He wasn't sure what it was, but he wasn't about to throw away a chance to get out of this alive. "All right," Jake said, finally lowering his knife. "But if you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it." The man nodded, his expression serious. "Understood." Jake motioned for the girl to come closer. She hesitated at first, still unsure, but slowly she stepped forward. Her eyes flicked from Jake to the man, her face still pale with fear, but there was something in her eyes that had changed. Trust. A flicker of hope. Jake could see that she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. They needed to move. The ravens were still out there, and Jake wasn't about to risk being caught again. He turned to the man. "How do we get out of here?" he asked. The man's gaze shifted, his eyes scanning the area outside the shack. "There's a way through the woods," he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep us off the main roads. The ravens won't be able to track us easily." Jake nodded. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best shot. "All right," Jake said, "lead the way." The man moved to the door, checking the outside before stepping out, followed by Jake and the girl. The air outside was cold, the wind rustling the trees, but Jake's senses were heightened. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement a potential threat. He glanced at the girl, who was staying close behind him, her eyes wide, but determined. They moved swiftly, staying low to the ground as the man led them through the dense forest. Jake kept his ears open, listening for any signs of danger, but the night was eerily quiet. They passed through thick trees, their branches reaching out like claws, the forest closing in around them. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was in control. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but as long as he had a breath in his lungs, he would protect her. The path grew steeper as they climbed, but the man kept a steady pace, moving with the ease of someone who knew these woods well. Jake followed close behind, keeping the girl in his line of sight, his hand ready on the knife at his side. The air grew colder, the higher they went, and Jake could feel the chill seeping into his bones, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't worried about the cold. He was worried about the ravens. It wasn't long before they reached a small clearing. The man stopped and turned to face them. "This is it," he said. "We'll take a break here, but we can't stay long. The ravens won't be far behind." Jake glanced around, his eyes scanning the edges of the clearing. It was quiet, too quiet. He had a bad feeling, but there was no time to second guess. They needed to move before the ravens got any closer. He motioned for the girl to sit down. She complied, her body slumping with exhaustion. Jake crouched next to her, his eyes still scanning the area. "We'll be all right," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. She nodded, not speaking, but the fear in her eyes hadn't faded. It had been hours since they started running, and Jake could see how much it had taken out of her. The man had moved off to the edge of the clearing, keeping watch. Jake felt a flicker of gratitude toward him. He wasn't sure if he trusted him completely yet, but he had kept his word so far. "We're almost out of this," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the girl. He didn't know if that was true, but he had to believe it. He had to believe that they could make it out of this alive. A sudden noise broke the silence, a branch snapping in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine. The ravens were here. Jake's heart dropped. He grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Move. Now," he hissed. The man turned at the sound, his face hardening. "They're close. We need to go. Stay quiet." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the girl's hand, and together they sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, the trees swallowing them whole as they disappeared into the woods. The chase was on again, and this time, Jake knew there was no turning back. I am excited to bring you an unforgettable experience in our latest Hell Angels stories, filled with raw emotion, intense action, and heart-pounding moments. Join us as we follow the journey of a former Hell Angels member who, against all odds, finds himself caught in a dangerous chase to protect an innocent child. In these Hell Angels stories, you'll witness the powerful themes of survival, trust, and redemption. This gripping narrative takes you through a series of thrilling twists as the protagonist battles ruthless enemies, including the notorious Ravens gang, all while facing his own personal demons. With every step, the stakes rise, and the reader is pulled deeper into the world of the Hell Angels, where loyalty and honor collide in the most unexpected ways. Get ready for a roller coaster of emotions as you dive into these Hell Angels stories, where the line between right and wrong is blurred, and survival becomes a fight against time. From intense showdowns to moments of unexpected camaraderie, these Hell Angels stories will keep you at the edge of your seat, wondering what comes next. Will the protagonist and the child make it out alive, or will the ravens finally catch up with them? This is a story you won't want to miss, filled with action, suspense, and the unbreakable bond of trust between two unlikely allies. Immerse yourself in these Hell Angels stories now, and experience a world where every decision could be their last.